Now, I'd like to ask you about just overall the situation globally. You know, China right now is also a huge discussion. NATO back in June called China a malicious actor that it had to now start paying attention to militarily, despite the fact that China is way in the Pacific and the North Atlantic is nowhere close to China. But nonetheless, that was the new strategic concept document labeling China now a threat as well as Russia. And, you know, over the last, decade, but really 5 or so years, there's been massive escalations, and Europe has got caught up in this desire to decouple from China, to kind of go along with what really is, again, similar to Russia, a U.S. Instigated conflict against China. What has been your thoughts about this over the years, and where do you see this situation now?
Yeah, it's a really amazing story, really, when you think about it, like the power of propaganda and how you can try and manipulate the mainstream narrative. I mean, when China began to open up economically, like when I was finishing school, maybe what, 30 years ago or so, well, actually a bit more than that, 35 years ago, it was seen as a sort of like the up and coming people wanted to learn Chinese. They wanted to go to China. If you went to China, you were seen, you were the new kids on the block. That was the most advanced, the most able people wanted to open up a new world economy and so on. It was seen to be a great step forward. Now, if you said you went to China, people go, you went to China? What were you doing there? We all know they're all whatever. And it's the same country. Like, if anything, they've opened up more on that. So it's amazing how you can manipulate things. Look at China is the EU's biggest trading partner and will remain so. And we had a really interesting discussion in the last plenary where even the High Representative Joseph Borrell, not known for his modesty or great mind, he had to stuff it into the members of the European Parliament to say, listen, lads, there's going to be no decoupling from China here now. You might as well cop yourselves on in that one. Interesting that it came after the meeting between Biden and Xi as well, after the G20, where again, Biden said the same thing. We're not going to decouple. We're not out to sort of undermine China or anything like that. But it's speaking out of two sides of your mouth, because while they're saying that on the one hand, on the other hand, they're ratcheting up the anti-China rhetoric as well. They're destabilizing the situation in Taiwan. While they say they aren't, they really see this as a sort of a new Ukraine. So it's a balancing act. They don't want to go too far, but they want to have that in reserve in the background. So the Chinese are coming after the Russians are coming. They're kind of occupied with the Russians now, but the Chinese are next. And we get it morning, noon, and night in the European Parliament. And it was really interesting that we had a meeting recently. It was in camera, which meant the public couldn't go, very transparent and democratic values there and all the rest. But it was about China and Russia interference in Africa. And I mean, when you listen to even the experts that they brought in who had an agenda, and they showed about, you know, social media use and all this kind of thing. And I asked, well, have you done an analysis of the EU's intervention in Africa and their social media, or the US's? No, they hadn't, like, you know. But at the same time, they said, look, we've no evidence of China doing anything except trying to promote its own interests economically. They're not interested in regime change anywhere. Yes, they use social media to promote themselves, but I mean, what would you expect them to do? Use social media to undermine themselves? That's frankly rubbish. That's what everyone does, you know. There's nothing. So actually, there's no proof of China being a malign interest anywhere. They're just the biggest competitor to the US. But actually, the European Commission and the European Council, who are less mad than the European Parliament, were very clear to say we are not decoupling with China, whereas a lot of the MEPs were saying we have to learn the lessons. We were too dependent on Russian gas. Look where that got us. Now we have to decouple with China. You can't do that. That's like unscrambling an omelette. it's frankly impossible for the world economy to operate on that basis. And one of the biggest things that we're not talking about enough is that the biggest problem facing the globe is the climate crisis. And actually these wars, we need to cooperate with China on that. But this war has actually resulted in the EU undoing a lot of its climate goals, which is really scary as well. So, I mean, it's a mixed bag in terms of China. They use it to ratchet up the rhetoric and that. And there is a whole new industry now where there's huge money to be made on inflating the threat narrative from disinformation, cyber attacks and hybrid warfare. And they all sound great. And of course, it's brilliant because you can't prove who started it. So it's the gift that keeps on giving. And you've all of these think tanks and that who are making an absolute fortune advising the parliaments that these threats are out there everywhere. Whereas propaganda has existed since the beginning of time. We don't say that China and Russia don't do propaganda. Of course they do. The thing is, they're actually crap at it. They're way worse at doing it than the US is, for example, or the EU for that matter. So it's an interesting one. There's definitely forces trying to carve a wedge because they see China as being the dominant force globally, which they are and which they will be. And to me, you know, you can look at the war and say this has been a great victory for US empire. But actually, to me, I don't see that. I mean, to me, it's the last bite of a dying snake. This is the so destructively awful stuff that's not benefiting anyone in the States either. They might have, you know, got the dollar on a par with the euro. They might have succeeded in convincing the Egypts in Europe to pay 4 times the amount for LNG than ye pay for it in the States. That's not going to last that long. And the divisions that are going to follow that are going to be severe, not to mind the fact the amount of money that the US taxpayer is having to pay to foot the bill to feed your arms industry is just bizarre and terrible.